The last full heat of the afternoon had long since softened into a gentle, slanting light that lay across the open hills like a breath held quietly in the chest. You were walking a narrow sheep track halfway up the long slope, your sandals pressing into the dusty earth with a slow, even rhythm that matched the steady beat of your heart. The turf beneath your feet was short and dry, cropped close by many months of hungry mouths, and it released a faint scent of wild thyme and warm stone every time your weight shifted. Above you, the sky stretched wide and pale, a washed-out blue that was just beginning to think about the color of evening, while below you the shallow valley sank into a haze of gold and green, the distant stream nothing more than a thread of reflected light. You paused for a moment, not because anything needed attention, but simply because the body knows when to stop and let the world catch up, and you stood with one hand resting on the rough wood of your crook, feeling the grain of the ash under your thumb. The flock was spread across the hillside in a loose, moving pattern, each sheep a small shape of dirty white or soft grey against the grass, their shadows stretching long and thin to the east. They were not far, never far, but they had wandered apart during the afternoon, following the best tufts of grass in that mindless, contented way that sheep have. A ewe lifted her head and chewed slowly, her jaw moving from side to side, and then she dipped her nose back to the ground without any sign of hurry. You watched her for a long moment, noticing the way the light caught the tips of her ears and turned them almost pink, and then you drew a slow breath and made a low sound in your throat, a soft call that was not quite a word, more like a note that the hills had taught you long before you had words for such things. The sound carried easily in the still air, not loud but clear, and it rolled out across the slope like a stone dropped into flat water. The nearest sheep heard it and paused, their ears swiveling toward you, and then they returned to their grazing as if nothing had happened, though you knew they had noted the call and filed it away in their simple minds. That was the way of it. You never rushed the flock, because rushing only made them scatter and fret, and there was no need for hurry now. The sun would take its own time sinking behind the far ridge, and you had walked these hills enough years to know exactly how many steps lay between the first call and the final gathering. So you made the sound again after a comfortable pause, a little longer this time, letting the notes stretch out and fall away into the quiet, and you watched the sheep begin to respond in their own slow fashion. One by one, in no particular order, the ewes and lambs lifted their heads and seemed to consider the sound, turning their faces toward the higher pasture where you stood. The first to move was an old ewe, with a dark patch over one eye, a sheep you knew well, because she had led the flock for many seasons and always seemed to understand your signals before the others. She took a step uphill, then another, her wide body swaying gently from side to side, and the lamb at her side followed without question, its short legs working quickly to keep up. As she moved, the sheep nearest to her noticed the change and decided that if she was walking, there must be a reason, and so they too turned and began a slow drift up the slope. The movement spread outward like a ripple, and soon the whole flock was in motion, a quiet tide of wool and breath flowing toward you. You stayed where you were, leaning your weight onto the crook and letting your eyes travel across the gathering animals. The light had shifted while you watched, the pale blue of the sky deepening just a shade, and the shadows on the grass had grown longer and softer at the edges. A few thin clouds high overhead caught the first hint of warmth, turning from white to a faint honey color, and the air began to cool in that barely noticeable way that comes when the sun loses its grip on the land. You felt it on the back of your hands first, a light touch of evening that made the fine hairs rise, and then on your cheeks as you turned your head to count the flock. Counting was not a matter of numbers, not really. You knew the sheep by their faces, by the set of their ears, by the way a certain lamb always walked close to its mother's left flank rather than the right. Your eyes moved from one to the next, checking off familiar shapes in your mind, and the quiet tallying was its own kind of rest. There was the ewe with the torn ear, the one who always held her head a little to the side, and there was the lamb with the black spot on its rump that made it easy to find in the dusk. A young ram with horns just beginning to curl walked apart from the others, his movements more deliberate, and you noted him and moved on. The whole flock was present, every last one, and the knowledge settled into you like a stone sinking into calm water. The first of the sheep reached the level ground where you stood, and they slowed their pace automatically, spreading out again to find a mouthful of grass before the night truly came. The old ewe with a dark patch walked right up to you, close enough that you could have reached out and touched the coarse wool on her shoulder, and then she stopped and gave a low, rumbling bleat that seemed to come from deep in her chest. You answered her with a murmur, something soft and meaningless, and she seemed satisfied, turning away to nibble at a tuft of clover that grew beside a flat stone. More sheep arrived in a steady but unhurried flow, their hooves making small clicking sounds on the harder patches of ground, their breathing a soft chorus of exhaled air and the occasional sniff. The lambs stayed close to their mothers, some already pressing their noses into the wool of a flank, seeking the last milk of the day. You began to walk again, not to lead but to accompany, moving alongside the flock as they drifted naturally toward the high pasture where you would all spend the night. The path you followed was one you could have walked with your eyes closed. A faint line in the grass that wound between scattered thorn bushes and patches of bare, chalky soil. Every stone was familiar, every turn in the track known by your feet before your mind even registered the change, and the walk itself became a kind of meditation, each step a small thing that asked nothing of you. The sheep flowed around you like water around a rock in a stream, some ahead, some behind, all moving in the same general direction, with the patience of creatures who have no need to be anywhere else. The light continued its slow fade, and the colors of the hillside began to soften and blend together. The bright green of the grass dulled to a muted olive, the white of the sheep's wool took on a blue-gray tint, and the sky above shifted through a series of gentle gradations that had no sharp edges, only a smooth passage from pale gold to a dusky rose to a soft lavender that spread across the whole dome of the heavens. You noticed these changes without comment, letting them register in the back of your mind while your attention stayed on the flock and the ground ahead. A few birds passed overhead, starlings perhaps, their wings making a faint whistling sound, and then they were gone into the darkening east, and the silence closed back around you like a familiar blanket. The high pasture opened out before you, a broad shoulder of the hill that flattened into a wide, gently sloping bench of grass and clover, sheltered on one side by a low outcropping of stone that had weathered into rounded shapes over centuries of wind and rain. This was the place you had chosen many nights before, a spot that offered a clear view down the valley and across to the next ridge, while still feeling tucked into the landscape, held by the hill itself. The sheep recognized it too. They slowed and then stopped, some immediately folding their legs and sinking to the ground with a deep, contented sigh. Others standing still and chewing cud, while their eyes half closed in the manner of animals who know they have arrived. You walked through the settling flock, your feet careful between the bodies, and found the patch of ground that you thought of as your own. It was a slight hollow in the turf, just large enough for a man to lie down, and the grass there was thicker and softer than elsewhere, a small luxury that the hill offered without being asked. You slicked the strap of your crook from your shoulder and laid the long wooden shaft on the ground beside the hollow, close enough that you could reach it without stretching, and then you bent to remove your cloak. The wool was rough and heavy, still holding a faint warmth from the sun, and as you spread it over the grass it made a soft rustling sound that mingled with the evening air. You smoothed the fabric with your palms, pressing out the wrinkles and folds until it lay flat. A simple bed of woven fleece that would keep the chill of the earth from your bones during the night. A second piece of cloth, smaller and softer from many washings, came out of a leather pouch at your belt, and you folded it twice to make a cushion for your head. The leather pouch itself, containing the remains of your evening meal and a bottle of water, you set to one side, and then you stood for a moment longer, surveying the flock one last time before the light failed completely. The sheep were all settled, all settling, the lambs tucked against their mothers, the older ewes lying in small groups, and the young ram had found a spot on the edge of the flock where he could watch the valley with a still, serious attention. Everything was as it should be, and the feeling that came with that knowledge was as old and steady as the hills themselves. You knelt on the cloak and felt the give of the grass beneath it, the slight springiness of the living turf that had cushioned many shepherds before you. The ground still held a trace of the day's warmth, and it rose up through the wool and into your knees, a gentle reminder that the earth was not yet cold. You eased yourself down, first onto your side, then onto your back, and you let your head rest on the folded cloth with a slow release of breath. Your hands came to rest on your chest, one over the other, and you lay looking up at the sky that was now a deep, soft blue, with the last traces of rose fading in the west. A single star had appeared, high and steady, and you fixed your eyes on it for a while, letting its small light anchor your gaze. The sounds of the flock were all around you, a quiet fabric of noise that had no sharp edges. Somewhere to your left a ewe was chewing slowly, her teeth making a soft grinding sound that rose and fell in a steady rhythm. A lamb gave a short, sleepy bleat and was answered by its mother's low murmur, and then both fell silent. The slight clink of a hoof against a stone came from the edge of the flock, followed by a huff of breath as a sheep shifted its weight, and then that too passed. The air moved gently, so gently that you could barely feel it on your face, just enough to carry the scent of grass and wool and the faint, clean smell of the distant stream. You closed your eyes for a moment and listened to the flock settling deeper into rest, their breathing a soft tide that seemed to pull the whole hillside into a slower rhythm. When you opened your eyes again, more stars had come out, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds thrown by a careful hand. The evening had fully arrived, and the world had shrunk to this one hillside, this one flock, this one hollow of grass where you lay. The sheep were motionless now, their bodies soft mounds of shadow against the paler ground, and the silence between their small sounds was deep and complete. You let your thoughts drift without direction, not thinking of anything in particular, just aware of the solid earth beneath you, the cool air above, and the quiet company of the animals all around. The last light drained from the western horizon, and the night gathered itself over the hills, and you lay still, waiting for nothing, expecting nothing, simply present in the slow, calm unfolding of the shepherd's evening. After the flock had settled and the light had gone from the sky, you remained standing for a short while longer, letting the cool air move across your face as you considered the small patch of ground that you had chosen for the night. It lay a few steps from the main cluster of sheep, a shallow depression in the turf that the hillside seemed to have made just for this purpose, and you walked to it now with the slow, measured pace of someone who had done this same thing more times than he could possibly count. The cropped grass under your sandals was springy and dry, and as you approached the hollow, you noticed the way the faint, lingering warmth of the day rose from the earth and brushed against your ankles. The sky above the eastern ridge had deepened to a dusty blue, a color that reminded you of the way cold water looks in a deep well, and the first faint pricks of starlight were beginning to show through the fabric of the heavens. You removed the thick woolen cloak from your shoulders, lifting it with both hands and feeling the familiar weight of it settle into your arms. The fabric was coarse and heavy, woven from the dark fleece of your own flock by hands that had worked the wool since childhood, and it carried a rich scent of lanolin and wood smoke and open air that had become part of its very fibers. Holding it before you, you shook it once, a gentle snap that loosened the dust of the day and made the cloth billow softly, and then you bent to spread it over the grass in the bottom of the hollow, laying it flat with careful, deliberate movements. The wool caught on the stems of clover as you smoothed it, and you had to lift the edge once or twice to free a caught thread, your fingers working with the patient attention that comes from having no need to hurry. The ground beneath the cloak was uneven in small ways, with little hummocks of grass and tiny hollows where rainwater had once collected, and as you pressed the fabric down with your palms, you felt these contours through the wool, mapping the shape of the earth beneath. A patch of plover, with its 3 lobed leaves, made a slight cushion under the left side of the cloak, while a flat stone no bigger than your hand pressed up from below on the right, and you shifted the cloth a finger's width to one side so that the stone would not dig into your shoulder during the night. The grass stems crinkled softly as you worked, a dry whisper that seemed loud in the quiet of the evening, and the sheep nearest to you lifted their heads for a moment and then lowered them again, satisfied that nothing had changed. You knelt on the edge of the cloak and untied the leather pouch that hung from your belt, a simple bag of darkened hide that held the few things a shepherd needed for a night on the hills. From it you drew a smaller piece of cloth, lighter than the cloak and softer from countless washings, a square of undyed linen that you had carried for years and that had faded to the color of pale cream. This you folded in half, and then in half again, making a small firm cushion no thicker than the length of your thumb, and you placed it at the head of the cloak where your head would rest. The linen was cool against your fingers, smooth in a way that the wool was not, and you adjusted its position several times until it sat exactly in the center of the hollow, aligned with the slight slope of the ground, so that your head would be just a little higher than your feet. The shepherd's crook you laid on the ground beside the cloak, its long ash shaft resting parallel to your sleeping place and close enough that you could reach out and touch it without fully waking. The wood was worn smooth in the places where your hands had held it over the years, the surface polished to a dull sheen that caught the faint starlight, and the curved crook at the top made from a naturally bent branch, rested against a tuft of grass as if it had grown there. You ran your thumb along the length of it once, a habit so old you no longer noticed it, and then you left it where it lay and turned your attention back to the flock. Around you the sheep were settling into their own places for the night, a gradual process that seemed to happen without any signal or plan. An old ewe near the center of the group folded her front legs first, then her hind legs, sinking down onto the grass with a long, rumbling sigh that seemed to come from deep within her wide-barreled chest. Her lamb, already half asleep, dropped beside her and pressed its small body against her flank, its nose disappearing into the wool, and the ewe turned her head once to touch her lips to the lamb's ear before closing her eyes. Another sheep, a wether with a thick neck and a patient expression, remained standing for a longer time, chewing his cud with the steady, grinding motion of his jaw, his eyes half soot, and his tail twitching occasionally at some unseen fly. The rest of the flock followed suit in their own time, some lying down quickly, as if they had been waiting all afternoon for this moment, others circling once or twice, and then dropping with a soft grunt, and soon the whole hillside was dotted with the low, dark shapes of resting animals. You stayed on your knees beside the cloak, not in any hurry to lie down, letting the quiet settle around you like water finding its level. The air had cooled enough now that you could feel the difference when a slight breath of wind passed over the back of your neck and you pulled the collar of your tunic a little higher, the rough wool scratching softly against your skin. The ground beneath your knees was still warm from the sun, and that warmth seeped up through the cloak and into your body, a faint, persistent heat that spoke of the long summer day just ended. You spread your palms flat on the wool and felt the texture of the weave, the thick threads crossing over and under in a pattern that was both regular and full of small imperfections, and you traced one of these threads with a fingertip, following its path until it disappeared under another. The sky had continued its slow change while you were busy with the cloak, and now when you looked up you saw that the dusty blue had deepened into a rich dark indigo, and the stars were no longer faint pricks, but bright, steady points of light scattered across the dome of the night. The first star you had noticed earlier, the one that had appeared while the western sky still held a trace of rose, now shone more strongly, a white spark directly overhead, and you let your gaze rest on it for a long moment, feeling the quiet pull of its distance. A thin band of cloud stretched across the northern horizon, barely visible now, and the moon had not yet risen, so the starlight was the only illumination, a soft silver glow that made the sheep's wool look almost blue and turned the grass into a sea of shifting grey shadows. You leaned back on your heels and took the water bottle from the leather pouch, a flask made of hardened hide with a wooden stopper, and you pulled the stopper free with a small pop. The water inside was still cool from the morning spring, and you took a slow sip, letting it wet your mouth and throat before swallowing, the liquid tracing a cold line down your chest. You replaced the stopper and set the bottle aside, then reached into the pouch again and found the small bundle of provisions that remained from your evening meal. A piece of hard bread wrapped in a cloth and a few early apples. But you did not take them out, only touched them to be sure they were there, a small ritual of checking that all was in order. The sheep had grown quieter now, their movements stilled, and the only sounds were the soft, rhythmic grinding of cud from a few who still chewed, and the occasional deep breath that lifted a woolly side and let it fall again. One of the lambs made a tiny sound in its sleep, a bleat so faint it was barely more than a breath, and its mother answered without waking, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground and into your knees. The whole flock seemed to breathe together, a slow tide of air that rose and fell in a pattern older than the hills, and you felt your own breathing begin to match theirs, your chest lifting and falling in the same unhurried cadence. You shifted your weight and stretched your legs out before you, the muscles in your calves and thighs, releasing a tension you had not realized they held. Your sandals, simple soles of leather with straps that crossed over your instep, were dusty from the walk, and you brushed the dust away with a few swipes of your hand, the small particles falling onto the cloak in a fine, pale drift. The straps had left faint marks on your skin, light indentations that would fade by morning, and you rubbed them absently, feeling the slight tenderness where the leather had pressed. Then you pulled your feet back and sat cross-legged on the edge of the cloak, your hands resting loosely on your knees, and you let your head fall forward just a little, the posture of someone who is not quite ready for sleep, but is no longer fully awake. In this half-sitting, half-resting state, you noticed the small things that the daylight would have hidden. A beetle made its slow way across a stem of grass near your hand, its shell a dark brown that gleamed faintly in the starlight, and you watched it travel the length of the stem and disappear into the thicker growth below. A few paces away, one of the ewes shifted her position, stretching out a hind leg and then curling it back, her hoof scraping softly against the ground. The distant stream, which you could not see but knew was there at the bottom of the valley, made a faint, continuous murmur that was less a sound and more a presence, a low note that underpinned the silence like the drone string of a musical instrument. You thought about the day that had passed, but not in any focused way, just a loose string of images that drifted through your mind without connection or meaning. The sun on the back of your neck during the noon rest, the taste of the hard cheese you had eaten beside the little spring, the way a cloud had cast a shadow that moved slowly across the opposite hillside. All these things passed before your inward eye like leaves floating on a slow stream, and you let them pass without holding on to any of them. The night was too calm for memory, too complete for anything but the simple fact of being there, on that hillside, with the flock and the stars and the cooling earth. Eventually you uncurled your legs and lay back on the cloak, settling your shoulders into the wool, and letting your head rest on the folded linen cushion. The ground received your weight with a gentle give, the grass and soil beneath the cloak compressing just enough to shape themselves around your body, and you felt the line of your spine straighten and relax as you stretched out. The cloak was not thick enough to erase every contour of the earth, and you could still feel the slight rise of the clover patch under your left shoulder and the faint hollow where your hips pressed down. But these were familiar sensations, part of the night's geography, and they brought a sense of being held rather than discomfort. You crossed your hands on your chest, the way you always did, right hand over left, and you could feel the slow beat of your heart through your palms, a steady rhythm that seemed very distant and very close at the same time. Your eyelids grew heavy, and you let them close, the starlight fading to a soft red glow behind your lids. And you listened to the flock breathing all around you, a quiet ocean of air that never stopped. The world had shrunk to this single hillside, to the warmth of your own body and the solid presence of the ground beneath. And as the last tensions of the day melted into the earth, you drifted on the slow current of the night, not yet asleep, but no longer awake, suspended in that peaceful place where a shepherd finds his rest. Lying on your back with your hands crossed on your chest and the folded linen cushion soft under your head, You let your thoughts drift without anchor, floating on the slow current of the night. The stars above were bright and still, the sheep were silent around you, and the ground held you in its gentle hollow like a cupped hand. In this quiet space between waking and sleep, your mind turned back to the afternoon, not as a story with a beginning and an end, but as a series of sensations and images that rose up and faded like the slow passing of clouds. You remembered walking, and the memory was so clear that for a moment you could almost feel the sun on your shoulders again and the dust of the path beneath your sandals. The walk had begun at the village common, a wide stretch of short grass and packed earth where the sheep had gathered in the early afternoon, while the sun still stood high and warm over the thatched roofs. You had arrived there after the midday rest, carrying your crook in your leather pouch, and the flock had been waiting for you in their scattered, patient way, some standing in the shade of the old oak tree that grew at the edge of the common, others grazing on the sparse grass near the stone well. The light had been bright and clear, a golden light that made the dust motes dance in the air, and you remembered the way the heat had risen from the ground in visible waves, shimmering above the packed earth like water. You had called the sheep with that same low sound you always used, and they had lifted their heads and begun to move toward you, their hooves making a soft, muffled clopping on the dry ground. From the common you had led them along the lane that ran between the last of the village gardens, where tall bean poles stood in neat rows and the leaves of the cabbages spread wide and dusty green. A woman had been drawing water from the well as you passed, the creak of the windlass a familiar sound, and she had raised a hand in greeting without speaking, the way people do when words are not needed. You had lifted your crook in reply and kept walking, the sheep flowing around you in a steady stream, and soon the gardens had fallen behind and the lane had narrowed to a track that wound between hedgerows of hawthorn and bramble. The hedges were thick with summer growth, the small hard green berries of the hawthorn just beginning to show, and the brambles had sent out long, arching stems that caught at your tunic if you walked too close. You remembered the smell of the hedgerow, a mix of dry earth and green leaves, and something faintly sweet from the last of the wild roses, and the way the track had been dappled with shade and sun in equal measure. The sheep had spread out along the track, some walking ahead, some lagging behind to snatch a mouthful of grass from the verge, and you had walked among them with the slow, steady pace of a shepherd who knows exactly how far he has to go. The track had begun to climb almost without you noticing, a gradual slope that rose away from the village and toward the open hills, and the hedgerows had thinned as the ground became poorer and more stony. The first chalky stones had appeared in the soil, small white lumps that caught the sunlight and threw it back in bright glints, and the grass had changed from the lush green of the lower fields to a shorter, finer growth that crackled underfoot. Wild thyme had grown in dense mats between the stones, and every time your sandal pressed down on a patch, the scent had risen up around you, sharp and clean and medicinal, mixing with the dust and the warm wool smell of the flock. The path had curved around the shoulder of a low hill, and as you rounded the bend you had come to the first gate, a simple barrier of rough-cut poles lashed together with strips of hide and hung on leather hinges that creaked when the wind blew. You had opened it without thinking, the weight of the gate familiar in your hands, and you had held it wide while the sheep filed through in their unhurried way, some stopping to sniff at the gatepost, others pushing through quickly as if eager to reach the open ground beyond. The last sheep through had been the old ewe with the dark patch over her eye, and she had paused beside you for a moment, looking up with her calm, yellow-eyed gaze, before walking on. You had closed the gate behind you, dropping the loop of hide over the post, and then you had continued upward, the track now little more than a pale line in the grass. Beyond the gate the landscape had opened out, the hedgerows giving way to open downland that rolled away in every direction like a great, still ocean of grass and sky. The hills were not dramatic. They were old and worn, their slopes long and gentle, their summits rounded and smooth, and they lay under the afternoon sun with the patience of ancient things. You had stopped for a moment, leaning on your crook to look out across the view. The valley below had been a patchwork of small fields and dark clumps of woodland, with the silver thread of the stream winding through it, and beyond the valley another line of hills had risen, paler and more distant, fading into a blue-grey haze. The sky had been enormous, a vast dome of pale blue with a few wispy clouds that hardly moved, their edges thin and feathery, and the sun had been a warm, steady presence on the left side of your face. You had felt the peace of the place settle into your bones, and then you had walked on, the sheep spreading out across the hillside like a slow-moving carpet of grey and white. The path had become fainter as you climbed, a mere trace in the turf that was more a suggestion than a trail, but your feet had known the way without any need for thought. You had walked along a contour line, neither climbing nor descending, and the hillside had sloped away below you in a long sweep of grass that was dotted with scattered thorn bushes and the occasional outcrop of chalky rock. The thorn bushes were old and gnarled, their trunks twisted into shapes like bent elbows, and their small dark leaves had cast tiny pools of shade that the sheep sometimes stopped in for a moment's relief from the sun. A few late butterflies, small and blue, had flickered among the stems of wild marjoram that grew in the longer grass, and you had watched them without really seeing them, your gaze taking in everything and nothing at the same time. The sound of the distant stream had come and gone as you walked, a soft, continuous murmur that rose and fell depending on the shape of the land. When the path dipped into a shallow fold in the hillside, the sound had faded almost to nothing, and when it climbed again, the murmur had returned. A gentle background note that was always there if you listened for it. The sheep had paid no attention to the sound, but you'd found it companionable, a quiet voice that spoke of water moving over stones far below. A skylark had risen from the grass somewhere ahead, its song pouring down from a high, invisible point in the sky, and you had lifted your head to look for it, shielding your eyes with your hand. But the bird had been too high to see, just a small dot of movement against the blue. Its song had continued for a long time, a stream of liquid notes that seemed endless, and then it had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the silence that followed had been deep and full. The sun had moved perceptibly across the sky as you walked, sliding down from its noon heights toward the western hills, and the shadows had begun to stretch. Your own shadow had walked beside you on the grass, a long, thin shape that mimicked your every movement, and the shadows of the sheep had been smaller, closer to their feet. You had noticed the way the light had changed, the bright gold of midday softening into a warmer, deeper color that made the grass look richer and the chalky stones glow with a faint pink tint. The air had begun to cool, just a little, a first hint of evening that touched your cheek and the back of your hands, and you had known that you were more than halfway to the high pasture now, that the walk was drawing to its quiet close. The sheep had known it too. Their pace had changed as the afternoon wore on, the lambs becoming less inclined to wander and the ewes walking more steadily, their heads low and their movements economical. The flock had drawn together into a tighter group, the scattered individuals closing the gaps between them until they moved as a single body, a slow wave of wool that flowed along the hillside in the same direction. You had walked among them, your crook resting on your shoulder, and you had felt the rhythm of their movement merge with your own, the many hooves and the two sandals binding a shared tempo. The dust of the path had puffed up in small clouds around your ankles, settling on the straps of your sandals and the hem of your tunic, a fine pale powder that was the very substance of the hills. As the sun had slipped lower, the colours of the landscape had deepened and intensified. The green of the grass had taken on a bluish tint in the shadows, while the sunlit slopes had glowed with a warm, honeyed light that seemed almost solid. The sky had gone through its slow, patient transformation, the pale blue giving way to a band of soft yellow at the horizon, which had then spread upward into a wash of rose and amber. The wispy clouds had caught these colours and held them, turning pink and gold against the deepening blue. And you had stopped again to look, not because the sight was new, but because it was never the same twice and always worth a moment's attention. The sheep had stopped too, as if they also felt the pause, and for a long still minute the whole world had seemed to hold its breath. Then the moment had passed, and you had walked on, the path now climbing more steeply as it approached the high pasture. The grass had become shorter here, grazed down to a fine turf by the sheep's many visits, and the soil was thinner, with patches of bare chalk showing through where the wind had scoured the slope. Your sandals had made a different sound on this ground, a sharper, crisper sound, and the sheep's hooves had clicked against the stones with a noise like small pebbles being dropped. The air had been cooler still, carrying the first true chill of evening, and you had pulled your cloak a little tighter around your shoulders as you climbed the last rise. And then you had reached the high pasture, the broad bench of level ground that you knew so well, and the memory began to soften and blur at its edges, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. You remembered the sheep spreading out across the grass, the old ewe finding her usual spot, the lambs pressing close to their mothers, and the way you had stopped to survey the flock one last time before the light failed completely. But these images were growing faint now, giving way to the immediate sensations of the present, the solid weight of your body on the cloak, the cool night air on your face, the quiet breathing of the sheep all around. The memory of the walk slipped away from you, as gentle as water draining into sand, and you were once again lying on the hillside under the stars. The afternoon now only a soft, warm glow at the back of your mind. You felt the grass beneath the cloak pressing up against your back, each stem and blade a tiny point of contact, and you let the sensation anchor you to the present moment, to the night, to the flock, to the deep and patient quiet that held everything in its still embrace. You lay still on your cloak, your body heavy and relaxed against the ground, and you let your eyes open fully to the night sky that now stretched overhead in a vast, silent dome. The last trace of twilight had long since drained from the western horizon, leaving behind a darkness so complete that the hills and the valley and the sleeping sheep had all merged into a single, seamless shadow. Above you the stars were no longer the scattered few that had appeared during the early evening. They had multiplied into a dense field of light, thousands upon thousands of tiny, steady points that filled the heavens from horizon to horizon. The sky on this late summer night was perfectly clear, without a wisp of cloud to soften its blackness, and the stars shone with a cold white brilliance that seemed almost close enough to touch. The first thing you noticed was the quality of the darkness itself, a deep velvety black that was not empty, but full of hidden texture. When you looked directly at a patch of sky between the stars, you saw not a flat void, but a subtle graininess, a faint suggestion of more light just beyond the edge of seeing. It was as if the darkness was a fabric woven from many fine threads, some slightly lighter and some slightly darker, creating a depth that drew your gaze into it without end. You had seen the night sky many thousands of times before, but it never felt the same. Each night had its own particular stillness, its own arrangement of stars, its own quiet mood. Tonight the mood was one of absolute calm, a stillness so profound that it seemed to hold the whole world in a gentle, breathless pause. Your eyes moved slowly across the sky, not searching for anything in particular, just tracing the patterns of light that presented themselves. One star caught your attention first, a bright point almost directly overhead that you had noticed earlier when the evening was still new. It hung there now with a clear, steady glow, its light a pure white with just the faintest hint of blue, and it seemed to pulse ever so slightly in the stillness, though you knew this was only the movement of the air or the workings of your own eyes. This star was brighter than any other in that part of the sky, and it served as an anchor for your gaze, a fixed point that you could return to whenever your thoughts began to wander. You let your attention rest on it for a while, watching the way its light reached down across the vast distance and entered your eyes, a journey that had taken longer than you could possibly imagine. Beside this bright star, and all around it, the lesser stars filled in the spaces with a fine granular scattering. Some shone with a slightly warmer light, a pale gold or soft yellow, while others were cooler, their color more of a diamond white. A few, the faintest ones, appeared only when you looked slightly to one side of them, vanishing when you tried to stare directly, a trick of the eye that you had learned to accept without question. The stars were not scattered evenly, they clustered in some places and thinned out in others, forming loose, unnamed shapes that your mind half recognized and then released. You did not try to trace the constellations, the figures of bears and hunters and serpents that the old stories named. You simply let the patterns be what they were, a quiet, unreadable language written across the dark. As your gaze drifted lower toward the eastern ridge, you noticed the faint misty glow of the Milky Way beginning to show itself, a soft band of light that rose from behind the dark shoulder of the hill and stretched upward across the sky. At first it was barely visible, just a subtle brightening of the darkness like the first hint of dawn, but as your eyes adjusted and you looked with a relaxed, unfocused gaze, the band resolved into a river of countless tiny stars, so close together that their light blended into a continuous, milky haze. It flowed from the east to the zenith and then curved away toward the west, a great arch of diffuse radiance that divided the sky into two halves. The longer you looked at it, the more detail you saw, darker patches where the stars were thinner, brighter knots where they gathered in small clusters, and a soft, almost silvery texture that seemed to shimmer without moving. The Milky Way had no beginning and no end that you could see. It simply emerged from the dark hill and disappeared into the dark hill, a road of light that went nowhere and everywhere. You let your gaze follow the band across the heavens, moving with it from east to west in a slow, lazy drift. Near the zenith, a particularly bright knot of stars caught your attention, a small, tight cluster that looked like a handful of diamond dust thrown against the black, and you paused there, noting the way the individual points of light seemed to dance if you looked long enough. Though this too was only the tremor of the living eye. The Milky Way was a familiar sight, something you had seen on every clear night of your life, but it never lost its quiet mystery. It was simply there, a part of the night, like the hills and the sheep and the cool air on your face, and it asked for nothing but your silent attention. The stars, you noticed, were not all perfectly still. Some of the brighter ones twinkled, their light flickering in tiny, rapid pulses that came and went, while the fainter ones remained steady. The twinkling was more pronounced near the horizon, where the starlight had to pass through a thicker layer of air, and the low stars above the western ridge seemed to dance and shimmer in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. One star, low and bright and steady, hung just above the dark shape of the next hill, and it did not twinkle at all, but shone with a constant, unwavering light. You realized after a long moment that this was not a star in the ordinary sense, but a planet, one of the wandering lights that moved slowly among the fixed stars over the course of many nights. It was too bright for anything else, and its stillness set it apart from the flickering field around it. You watched it for a while, noticing how its light was slightly warmer than the star you had been looking at before, a pale honey color that seemed almost friendly, and you felt a quiet sense of companionship in its steady presence. The planet, like the bright star overhead, gave your gaze a place to rest, and you let your attention settle on it. As the minutes passed, you knew from experience that if you watched for a long time, you might notice the slow movement of the sky as a whole, the great wheel of stars turning imperceptibly around a fixed point far to the north. But that movement was far too slow to see. You could only know it from memory, from the way the stars had shifted their positions over the hours of many previous nights. For now, the sky seemed perfectly static, a painted dome that held everything in place, and the planet above the western hill was as fixed as a lantern hung in a high window. Its light fell softly on the dark slope of the hill, outlining the curve of the land in a faint, silvery glow, and you could see the rough shape of the thorn bushes and the pale smudge of the chalk outcroppings in that gentle illumination. The sheep were completely still now, their bodies dark mounds against the starlit grass, and their breathing had settled into a deep, slow rhythm that was barely audible. Every so often a sheep would shift slightly, a soft rustle of wool against grass, and then the silence would close back over the sound like water over a dropped stone. You could hear the steady, low grinding of a cud-chewing ooze somewhere to your left, her jaws working in a slow circular motion that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The sound was so regular that it became a kind of silence itself, a background presence that you noticed only when it stopped. And when it did stop, the true silence that followed was vast and deep. Then the chewing would start again, and the night would resume its quiet, rhythmic texture. The air was cool and dry against your face, and it carried a clean scent of grass and chalk dust, and the faint animal warmth of the flock. There was no moisture in it, no hint of dew yet, only the dry, pure breath of the high hills that had been heated by the sun all day and was now releasing its warmth slowly into the darkness. The scent of wild thyme still lingered from the afternoon, a faint herbal note that mixed with the earthier smells, and you breathed it in without thinking, letting it fill your lungs and then release. The absence of any insect noise was noticeable, a sign that the night had cooled enough to still the crickets and the grasshoppers, and this lack of sound only deepened the silence, making the stars seem closer and the hillside more remote. You felt your own breathing begin to slow as you lay there, your chest rising and falling in a gentle automatic rhythm that matched the quiet of the flock. Each breath was a small, unremarkable event. The cool air entering your nose and throat, the slight expansion of your ribs, the soft pause at the top, and then the slow release, the warm air leaving your body and mingling with the night. You did not try to control it, you simply let it happen. And as the minutes passed, your breathing became deeper and more even, settling into a pace that felt as old and steady as the hills themselves. Your heartbeat, too, was calm, a faint, regular thump that you could feel in your chest under your crossed hands, and it kept time with a rhythm that had nothing to do with clocks or hours, only with the slow turning of the earth. You let your eyes drift from the planet back to the bright star overhead, and then from there to the Milky Way, which had now risen higher in the east and stretched more clearly across the sky. Its light was a little brighter now, the band of misty radiance more defined, and you could see how it seemed to split into two parallel streams in some places, with a dark lane running between them like a river of shadow. The stars within it were so dense that they blended into a continuous glow, a soft, pearly luminescence that had no single source, and the effect was so calm and so beautiful that you felt your mind grow quiet just from looking at it. There was nothing to understand, nothing to figure out. There was only the light and the dark and the slow passage of the night. After a long while, you noticed that the arrangement of the stars had changed just slightly. The bright star that had been directly overhead was now a little to the west, and the planet had dipped a fraction closer to the hill. The movement was so small that you could not be sure you were seeing it, but you knew from many nights of watching that the sky was indeed turning, the whole vast wheel of stars pivoting around a hidden point in the north. This knowledge was not something you thought about with words. It was more like a deep bodily understanding, a sense of the earth's steady rotation that you felt in your bones. The sky was not a fixed ceiling, but a slow, silent river, and you were a small, still point on its bank, watching the water flow by. You thought about the other shepherds who had lain on this same hillside in years past, looking up at these same stars, and the thought was not a lonely one. It was comforting to know that the stars had been here long before you, and would be here long after, that your presence was just one small part of a much larger pattern. The hills, too, had been shaped by countless seasons of sun and rain and wind, and the sheep that slept around you were descended from flocks that had grazed these slopes for generations beyond counting. All of this history was present in the quiet night, not as a story, but as a simple fact, like the ground under your back and the air in your lungs. You let the feeling of connection wash over you without holding on to it, and it passed through you as gently as the starlight. The sheep nearest to you, the old ewe with the dark patch over her eye, let out a long, soft breath and shifted her weight, her wool rustling against the grass. You turned your head to look at her, and in the dim starlight you could see the outline of her body, the curve of her back and the way her head rested on the ground, with her ears drooping. Her lamb was a small darker shape pressed against her side, and you could just make out the rise and fall of its tiny ribcage as it breathed. The sight was so ordinary and so peaceful that it filled you with a quiet contentment, a sense that everything was exactly as it should be. You turned your head back to the sky and let your eyes close for a moment, feeling the cool air on your lids and the soft, steady pulse of your own blood in your ears. When you opened your eyes again, the sky was just the same. The stars still shining, the Milky Way still glowing, the planets still hovering above the hill. The night was deep and full and utterly still, and you lay there in the hollow of the grass, wrapped in your cloak, surrounded by your sheep, and watched the slow, silent turning of the heavens until the boundary between seeing and not seeing began to blur, and the stars seemed to look down on you with the same calm, unblinking patience that you offered to them. Full night had settled over the hillside, and with it came a silence so complete that you could hear the smallest things as if they were large and near. The air was motionless. Not a blade of grass stirred. Not a leaf on the distant thorn bushes trembled, and the great dome of the sky pressed down with a quiet weight that made every sound stand out clearly against the dark. You lay on your back, with your hands resting on your chest, your body heavy and still, and you let your ears open to the flock around you, letting the soft noises of the sleeping sheep become the whole world. The first sound you noticed was the steady grinding of cud from a ewe somewhere to your left. Her jaws moved in a slow circular rhythm, the teeth sliding against one another with a faint rasping whisper that rose and fell in a gentle cadence. It was a sound that had no beginning and no end, a continuous background murmur that you had heard on so many nights that it had become a kind of silence itself. You would only notice it when it paused, and then the true silence would rush in like water into a hollow. The grinding continued for a long stretch, then stopped for a few heartbeats while the ewe swallowed and drew a breath, and then it resumed with the same patient, unhurried pace. You listened to it without thinking, letting the rhythm settle into your own breathing until your chest rose and fell in time with the slow working of her jaw. Nearby, another sheep gave a soft, low cough, a single muffled sound that was more like a puff of air than a true cough. It came from somewhere to your right, and you turned your head slightly on the folded linen to catch the direction, though you could see nothing but the dark shapes of the flock against the starlit grass. The cough was followed by a brief rustle of wool, as the sheep shifted her weight, and then she too was still, her breathing settling back into the deep, even pattern of sleep. A moment later a lamb made a tiny sound, a bleat so faint that it was barely more than a whisper of air passing through its throat, and its mother answered with a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to travel through the ground and into your own body. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, and then the night absorbed it, leaving behind only the memory of the sound, a faint echo that hung in your ears before fading. You let your attention drift from one sheep to another, gathering the small sounds like a person might gather smooth stones from a stream. To your left and a little behind you, a wether was chewing his cud with a different rhythm, a slower, more deliberate grinding that paused often as he seemed to drift toward sleep and then woke again to chew. His jaw made a soft clicking sound at the end of each circular motion, a tiny noise like a pebble being turned over, and it repeated with a predictability that was deeply calming. Farther away, near the edge of the flock, a ewe was licking her lamb in the darkness. You could hear the faint, wet sound of her tongue moving across the lamb's wool, a gentle, repetitive lapping that went on for many minutes. The lamb responded with a soft, contented murmur, a sound that was almost a purr, and you felt your own body relax a little more at the warmth of it. One of the older yous, perhaps the one with the torn ear, let out a long sighing breath that seemed to empty her completely, and then she was silent, her side rising and falling with the slow tide of sleep. The sigh had a quality of deep release, as if the whole day had been held in her lungs and was now given to the night, and you found yourself exhaling along with her, your own breath leaving your body in a soft stream. The silence that followed the sigh was immense, a pause in which you could hear the blood moving in your ears, a faint, distant rushing like the sea heard from far inland. Then the sounds of the flock resumed, the chewing and the breathing and the occasional small rustle, and the night wove itself back together. Your own body was not silent, and you began to notice the small sounds you made as you lay among the sheep. When you shifted your shoulders to ease a slight stiffness in your neck, the rough wool of your tunic rustled against the cloak beneath you, a soft, scratchy whisper that seemed very loud in the stillness. The sound lasted only a moment, and then you were still again, but it had drawn your attention to the fabric of your clothing, and you became aware of the way the wool fibers rubbed together every time you breathed, a faint, continuous friction that was almost below the threshold of hearing. You lifted one hand from your chest and smoothed the wool of your cloak near your hip, feeling the coarse threads under your palm, and the sound of that smoothing was a low, sliding hush like wind over dry grass, a sound that you had made 1,000 times on 1,000 nights, and that had become part of the ritual of settling. The leather strap that bound your crook near the top gave a tiny creak when you moved your arm, a sound so small that you would not have heard it if the night had been any less still. The strap was old and well oiled, and the creak was more a suggestion of a sound than a true noise, a brief high note that vanished as soon as it appeared. You had heard that creak before, many times, and it was a familiar part of the night's music, a marker of your place beside the flock. The crook itself, lying on the grass within reach, made no sound at all, but you knew that if you were to pick it up and shift it, the wood would give a soft, dull thud against the ground, a sound you had no need to make now. The potential for that sound was there, a quiet presence in your mind, and that was enough. You turned your head on the linen cushion, and the fabric rustled against your hair, a sound like the brushing of a hand over a page of fine parchment. The linen was soft and worn, and it yielded to the movement with a gentle sigh, then settled into silence. Your hair, which was matted slightly from the day's dust, made a faint, dry whisper as it moved, and you raised your hand to smooth it back from your forehead, your fingers passing over your scalp with a soft, rhythmic scratching that you could hear as clearly as if you were scratching the bark of a tree. The sound of your own touch was intimate and close, a private noise that belonged only to you and the night. Beyond your immediate circle of sheep and the small sounds of your own body, the hillside held other, more distant noises that came to you across the still air. Far down in the valley, an owl called once, a low, hollow note that floated up the slope and reached you after a long moment, so faint that it might have been a memory of a sound. The call did not repeat, and you lay listening for it, your ears reaching out into the dark, but the owl remained silent, and the valley returned to its deep quiet. The stream which you had heard during the afternoon walk was now only a faint, continuous murmur at the very edge of your hearing, a sound so low and steady that it was more a feeling than a sound, a vibration that seemed to come up through the ground rather than through the air. It was always there, that murmur, a constant companion to the night, and you had grown so used to it that you noticed it only when you deliberately listened, as you did now. A slight breeze, the first you had felt since lying down, passed over the hillside with a sound like a distant breath. It was so gentle that it did not stir the grass or ruffle the sheep's wool. It simply moved through the air with a soft, sighing quality that rose and fell, and then was gone. You felt it on your face as a faint coolness, and you heard it as a whisper that passed from the east to the west and faded into nothing. The breeze left behind a deeper stillness, a silence that seemed to have been refreshed, and the sounds of the flock resumed their place in the foreground, the chewing and the breathing and the occasional small movement. One of the lambs, perhaps dreaming, made a soft, whimpering sound and kicked out with a tiny hoof, striking the ground with a muffled thud that was more felt than heard. The mother ewe stirred beside it, and you heard the gentle nuzzle of her nose against the lamb's body, a soft, damp sound of reassurance that quieted the lamb instantly. The whole interaction lasted only a few seconds, a brief ripple in the calm, and then both animals settled back into sleep, their breathing synchronizing into a single smooth rhythm. You listened to that rhythm for a while, the steady in and out of two pairs of lungs working side by side, and the sound was so regular that it became a lullaby without a melody, a simple, biological clock that marked the passing of the night with each breath. The sheep nearest to your head, a young ewe with a pale face, was dreaming too, her legs twitching slightly against the grass in a silent chase across some imagined pasture. You could hear the soft, rapid movement of her hooves against the ground, a light, scuffing sound that went on for a few moments and then stopped. Her breathing quickened for a heartbeat, then slowed, and she let out a soft, whistling snore that was so small and so brief that you almost missed it. The snore was followed by a deeper breath, and then she was quiet again, her body a dark, unmoving shape against the stars. The sounds of the flock blended together into a single, textured quiet that had no sharp edges. The chewing sounds, the soft coughs, the occasional bleat, the rustle of wool, all merged into a gentle, living silence that was the sound of many animals resting in peace. You let your attention sink into this quiet, not focusing on any one sound, but letting the whole wash over you like water, and you felt your mind begin to slow, its usual chattering fading into the background. The minutes passed without any change, the same sounds repeating in endless soothing variation, and each repetition was a small anchor that held you to the present moment. You became aware of your own breathing again, the air moving in and out of your lungs with a soft, regular sound that was so close it seemed to fill your entire head. Each inhalation brought the cool night air into your body, and each exhalation released a small puff of warmth that mingled with the air above your face. The sound of your breathing was like a quiet tide, a gentle rise and fall that matched the breathing of the sheep, and you let yourself drift on that tide, your thoughts becoming loose and floating. You were not asleep, but you were no longer fully awake. You were in a place between, where the sounds of the world were both near and far, both heard and dreamed. The night continued in this way for a long time, the same sounds repeating, the same stillness holding everything in its quiet embrace. You shifted your hand on your chest, and the wool of your tunic rustled softly, a sound that you had heard before and would hear again, a sound that belonged to this night, and this hillside, and this flock. The sheep chewed their cud, the lambs dreamed their dreams, the distant stream murmured its endless song, and you lay in the hollow of the grass, listening, until the boundary between the sounds and the silence dissolved, and the whole world was nothing but a quiet, breathing dark. As you lay in the hollow of the grass with the stars turning slowly overhead, and the flock breathing quietly around you, your mind drifted without effort back to the meal you had eaten not long before, when the light had still been in the sky and the day had not yet fully given itself to the night. The recollection came not as a story, but as a series of small vivid sensations. The weight of the leather pouch in your hand, the smell of the dock leaf when you unfolded it, the coolness of the water on your throat. You let these sensations rise up and pass through you like the sounds of the sheep, each one a quiet anchor to the evening that had been and was now stored safely in your body. You remembered sitting on a tussock of grass, a raised clump of thick, springy turf that made a natural seat, while the flock grazed in their scattered way across the hillside. The sun at that hour had been low and golden, its light slanting across the valley and turning the sheep's wool into a soft, glowing fleece, and the shadows had been long and blue. The tussock had been warm from the afternoon sun, the heat seeping through the coarse wool of your tunic and into the backs of your thighs, and you had settled onto it with the comfortable heaviness of a body that had walked a long way and was glad to rest. The crook had been planted in the ground beside you, its end pushed into the soft earth so that it stood upright, and the leather pouch had been in your lap, the dark hide supple and familiar under your fingers. You had untied the thong that closed the pouch, a simple strip of rawhide that you had replaced many times over the years, and you had loosened the neck of the bag with a gentle tug. The pouch had opened with a soft, dry sound, the leather creaking slightly as it stretched, and you had reached inside with one hand, your fingers brushing against the small bundles and objects that made up a shepherd's evening provisions. The interior of the pouch had been cool and dim, a private little cave that smelled of old leather and bread and the faint, clean tang of the dock leaves that wrapped your cheese. You had known the contents by touch alone, and you had drawn them out one by one, laying them on your lap with deliberate care. The first item you had taken out was the bread, a piece of hard, dark barley loaf that was shaped like a rough, flattened ball and fit neatly in the palm of your hand. It had been baked 2 days before in the village oven, and it had dried since then into a firm, dense cake that had a slight sheen of cracked crust on the outside and a heavy, close-grained crumb within. You had held it up to the fading light, noting the way the surface was dotted with tiny flecks of bran and the darker specks of the millstone's grit, and then you had brought it to your nose, inhaling the faint, nutty scent of the barley flour that had been ground by hand and mixed with nothing but water and a pinch of salt. The bread had no yeast, so it was flat and solid, a food that was meant to last and to fill the stomach without any fuss. The second item was a small lump of white cheese wrapped in the dock leaf, the broad green leaf folded over and over to make a neat, tight package. The dock leaf had wilted slightly from the heat of the day, its edges curling and its surface growing soft, but it still held its shape and kept the cheese moist within. You had peeled back the layers of the leaf carefully, the green flesh of the plant releasing a fresh, slightly sour smell that mixed with the richer, creamier scent of the cheese. The cheese itself was small enough to fit in the hollow of your cupped hand, a soft white round that had been pressed and drained and then stored in a cool corner of the dairy. It was still slightly damp, its surface glistening in the low sunlight, and when you touched it with your fingertip, it yielded just a little, giving way with a soft, springy resistance. The third item was a handful of early apples, small and hard and still touched with green. The kind of apples that grew on the old tree near the village well. There were 3 of them, each no bigger than a child's fist, their skin smooth and tight and dotted with tiny pale freckles. One had a small brown spot on one side where it had rested against a branch, and another had a slight dimple at its base. But they were all firm and unbruised. You had set them on your lap beside the bread and the cheese, and they rolled slightly against the wool of your tunic, their weight a pleasant, round presence. With the food laid out before you, you had taken a moment to simply look at it, to appreciate the colors and the textures in the golden light, the deep brown of the barley bread, the pale ivory of the cheese, the green and red of the apples, the rich dark green of the dock leaf. The sight was satisfying in a deep, quiet way, a small still life painted on the cloth of your tunic, and you had felt a soft gratitude for the earth that had grown these things, and the hands that had prepared them. Then you had lifted the bread to your mouth and taken the first bite, and the memory of that moment was so clear that you could almost taste it now as you lay under the stars. The bread had resisted your teeth at first, its hard crust requiring a firm, steady pressure to crack through, and then it had given way with a dry, gritty crunch that you could feel in your jaw and hear in your ears. The crumb inside was dense and slightly chewy, and it absorbed the moisture of your mouth as you worked it, softening slowly into a thick, bland paste that tasted faintly of toasted grain and the earthy sweetness of the barley. Small hard flecks of bran caught between your teeth, and you had moved your tongue to dislodge them, a small automatic habit. The bread was not seasoned beyond the pinch of salt, so its flavor was mild and plain, a simple, honest taste that asked nothing of the eater except patience and a slow, thorough chewing. You had broken off a small piece of the cheese next, the white curd crumbling slightly between your fingers as you pulled it apart, and you had placed it on your tongue and pressed it against the roof of your mouth. The cheese was cool and slightly tangy, with a clean, milky flavor that spread slowly across your tongue, and its texture was soft and smooth, melting from a firm lump into a creamy, yielding mass that coated the inside of your mouth. You had let it sit there for a moment, feeling the coolness dissolve, and then you had taken another bite of the bread, the two textures coming together in a plain and satisfying combination. The dry bread and the moist cheese balanced each other, the one providing substance and the other providing a gentle richness, and you had chewed them together in a slow, unhurried rhythm. The apples had been the last to be eaten, and you had picked up the first one, the one with the brown spot, and had turned it over in your hand, feeling its smooth, cool skin and the slight give of the flesh beneath. You had bitten into it with a crisp, sharp crunch that was entirely different from the crunch of the bread, a high, clean sound that seemed to ring out in the quiet evening air. The skin of the apple had split under your teeth, releasing a spray of tart, fragrant juice that ran down your chin and wetted your lips, and the flesh inside was white and crisp and full of tiny, glistening cells that burst as you chewed. The flavor was sharp and green, with a pleasant astringency that made your mouth pucker just a little and then relax, and it cut through the heaviness of the bread and cheese like a cool breeze through warm air. You had eaten the apple slowly, turning it around and around to take small, even bites, and when you reached the core you had tossed it aside onto the grass, where it would dry and wither and eventually feed the soil. The second apple had been sweeter, its flesh softer, and its juice less sharp, and the third had been somewhere in between, a balanced mix of tart and sweet that left your mouth feeling clean and refreshed. After the apples were gone, you had licked the last traces of juice from your fingers, the taste lingering on your lips, and you had sat for a moment, letting the food settle in your stomach and the quiet of the evening wrap around you like a second cloak. You had taken the water bottle from the pouch next, the hardened hide flask that you had filled that morning at the spring, and you had pulled the wooden stopper free with a gentle tug. The bottle was cool to the touch, the water inside still carrying the chill of the deep earth from which it had come, and you had lifted it to your lips and tipped it slowly, letting the water flow into your mouth in a thin, steady stream. The water was cold and clear and faintly mineral, with a taste of clean stone and the faintest hint of something green, and it slid down your throat in a smooth, cooling column that you could feel spreading through your chest and into your stomach. You had taken several swallows, each one a small, refreshing shock that washed away the last crumbs of the meal, and left your mouth feeling clean and new. Then you had replaced the stopper and set the bottle aside, its weight now slightly lighter, and you had wiped your mouth with the back of your hand. After the meal was finished, you had wiped your hands on the grass, rubbing your palms back and forth across the cool, damp blades until the last trace of cheese and apple juice was gone. The grass had left faint green smudges on your skin, and your hands had smelled of crushed stems and damp earth, a clean, living smell that was the scent of the hills themselves. You had packed the remains of the food back into the pouch, the last piece of bread wrapped in its cloth, the cheese tucked back into the dock leaf, the single apple that you had saved for the morning. The pouch had been tied shut and set beside you on the tussock, and then you had stretched your arms above your head, feeling the pull of the muscles in your shoulders, and the pleasant ache of a body that had walked and worked, and was now at rest. The sun had sunk lower while you ate, its lower edge now touching the far ridge, and the light had shifted from gold to a deep, glowing amber that made the whole world look as if it had been dipped in honey. The air had begun to cool more noticeably, the warmth of the afternoon giving way to the first true chill of evening, and you had reached for your cloak, which had been lying folded beside you on the tussock. You had shaken it out, the heavy wool snapping softly in the still air, and then you had swung it around your shoulders, settling it into place with a practiced shrug. The cloak had enveloped you in its familiar weight, the thick, rough fabric draping over your back and arms and falling in heavy folds around your legs, and the warmth that it trapped was immediate and comforting, a cocoon of body heat that the cool air could not penetrate. You had pulled the edges of the cloak closer around your chest, tucking one corner under your chin, and you had felt the last of the sun's warmth on your face as the light faded and the sky deepened from amber to rose, to the soft, dusky blue of early night. The sheep had begun to settle around you, their grazing slowing and their movements becoming few, and you had known that it was time to find your sleeping place and make your bed for the night. But before you rose, you had sat for a moment longer on the tussock, full and warm and at peace, the taste of the bread and the cheese and the apple still lingering faintly on your tongue, the water still cool in your stomach, the cloak heavy and solid across your back, now lying in the hollow with the stars above and the sheep asleep around you. The memory of that meal returned as a soft, diffuse warmth that spread through your body. You could still feel the slight fullness in your belly, a gentle, reassuring pressure that told you the food was there, doing its quiet work. The taste of the barley bread, that faint nutty flavor, lingered at the back of your mouth, and if you pressed your tongue to the roof of your mouth, you could almost find the ghost of the cheese, the cool creaminess that had melted so slowly. The apples had left a clean, sharp aftertaste that mixed with the cool night air, and the water had left you feeling clear and light, your thirst entirely quenched. You shifted your legs under the cloak and felt the heavy wool settle over them, its weight a steady, grounding presence. The cloak had kept its warmth from the sun, and that warmth now surrounded your legs and hips, a gentle heat that seeped into your muscles and loosened the last small knots of tension. The ground beneath you was firm but yielding, the grass and the cloak combining to make a bed that was simple and sufficient, and you felt the solidity of the earth through the layers of wool and fabric, a deep, quiet support that asked nothing of you. Your hands rested on your chest, and you could feel the slow rise and fall of your own breathing, the steady rhythm that had become so calm and regular. The fullness in your stomach was a comfort, a small internal anchor that reminded you that all your needs had been met, that there was nothing more to do until the sun rose and the sheep stirred and the new day began. You let your eyes close, and the darkness behind your lids was soft and warm, the memory of the meal merging with the present sensations of rest and warmth and quiet. The cloak's weight across your legs was like a gentle hand pressing you down into the earth, and you let yourself sink into that pressure, into the deep, unshakable peace of a shepherd who had eaten, who was warm, and who had nothing left to do but sleep. You turned your head on the folded linen cushion and let your gaze travel away from the stars, away from the bright planet and the misty band of the Milky Way, and out across the dark landscape that lay beyond the sleeping flock. The hillside on which you rested was only one part of a much larger world, a world that now lay in deep stillness under the night sky, its shapes and contours softened by the darkness into a quiet tapestry of shadow and faint silver light. Your eyes had grown so accustomed to the dark that you could see the land almost clearly, the starlight painting everything in shades of deep blue and grey and black, each ridge and valley a different tone in a monochrome painting that stretched to the edge of sight. Directly before you, beyond the sheep that lay like dark boulders on the grass, the ground fell away in a long, gentle slope that descended toward the valley floor. You knew this slope intimately, every fold and every hollow, every patch of chalky soil and every clump of thorn, and in the starlight you could trace its contours as easily as you could trace the lines on your own palm. The grass on the slope was short and cropped, grazed down by the flock over many days, and it reflected the starlight with a faint, silvery sheen that made it look almost like water, a still, pale sea that rippled only when the breeze moved across it. The slope was not perfectly smooth. It was interrupted here and there by low, rounded hummocks and shallow depressions where rainwater gathered in the wetter months, and these features now showed as darker patches against the lighter grass, soft shadows that gave the land a gentle, undulating texture. Farther down, about halfway to the valley bottom, a line of thorn bushes marked the edge of an old boundary, their twisted shapes standing out as dense, black masses against the paler slope. The bushes were old and gnarled, their branches interlocking in a tangled thicket, and in the daytime they were full of small birds that darted in and out of the dark foliage. But now they were silent and still. Their leaves, a deep, dark green, looked almost black in the starlight. A single tree, A stunted oak that had grown at an angle from the constant push of the wind stood a little apart from the thorn bushes, its branches spreading out in a low, crooked canopy that seemed to gather the darkness around it. You could see the shape of the tree clearly against the sky, its bare upper twigs traced in fine black lines, and you remembered how its leaves rustled in the afternoon breeze, a sound that was now entirely absent. Beyond the thorn bushes and the stunted oak, the slope continued its gentle descent until it reached the valley floor, where the land flattened out into a broad, level plain that was crisscrossed by small fields and hedgerows and the dark, winding line of the stream. The stream was invisible from where you lay, hidden by the angle of the slope and the darkness of the valley, but you knew exactly where it ran, meandering from the north and curving in a slow, lazy bend before disappearing into the woodland to the south. You could trace its course in your mind, the way it passed under the old stone bridge near the mill, the way it widened into a shallow pool where the cattle sometimes stood on hot afternoons, the way it narrowed again, where the willows grew thick along its banks. In the stillness of the night, you could hear its faint, continuous murmur, a sound so low and steady that it was less a noise and more a presence, a constant, watery thread that ran beneath the silence of the valley. The fields on the valley floor were laid out in a patchwork of different shades, each one a slightly different tone of darkness depending on what grew there or what had been harvested. The wheat fields, which had been cut a few weeks before, were pale and smooth, their shorn stubble catching the starlight in a fine, even glow. The pastures where the cattle grazed were a deeper, rougher grey, dotted with the darker shapes of sleeping animals that you could just make out if you looked carefully. The hay meadows, still uncut in the late summer, were a soft, textured darkness, the tall grass bending in the faint breeze and making a gentle, sighing sound that rose up the slope in waves. A few small hedgerows divided the fields one from another, their lines as straight and dark as charcoal strokes on a pale paper, and here and there a solitary tree stood up from the flatness, a poplar or an ash that pointed toward the sky like a still, silent finger. To the north, beyond the valley, the land rose again into a long, rolling ridge that you knew as well as your own hillside. It was a dark, sleeping shape against the sky, its outlines smooth and even, like the back of a great animal lying down to rest. The ridge was higher than the hill where you lay, its summit a long, flat plateau that was covered in rough pasture and scattered stones, and on the very top there was a small clump of beech trees, their rounded crowns making a darker knot against the sky. You had walked on that ridge many times in the past, following the sheep when they wandered too far, or simply walking for the pleasure of seeing the land from a different angle, and you knew the way the wind always blew stronger. Up there, the way the grass was shorter and more wiry, the way the view opened out to show the next line of hills, and the next line beyond that. Tonight the ridge was a mute, dark presence, its details lost in the darkness, but its shape unmistakable, a familiar landmark that gave the landscape a sense of order and stability. To the south, the land fell away more gently, the valley opening out into a wider, flatter plain that stretched toward a distant forest, a vast dark expanse that you could just see as a low black line on the horizon. The forest was many miles away, too far to walk in a single day, and it was a place of ancient trees and deep shade, a place where the deer lived and where the charcoal burners made their smoky camps in the autumn months. From your hillside it was only a dark smudge, a faint suggestion of woodland that marked the edge of the known world, and beyond it the land rose again into hills that were paler and more distant, fading into a soft blue-grey haze even in the daylight. At night, in the starlight, those far hills were invisible, lost in the darkness, but you knew they were there, a silent chain of ancient uplands that continued on and on toward the sea. Closer to you on the hillside itself, there were features that the daylight would have shown clearly, but that the night had transformed into subtle variations of darkness. The patch of scree, a scatter of loose chalk stones that had fallen from a small outcrop above, lay a short distance to your left, and in the starlight it showed as a pale grey smear against the darker grass, its stones catching and reflecting the faint light in 1,000 tiny points. The scree was a place where the rabbits sometimes came to dig their burrows, and you had seen their small white tails bobbing among the stones in the early morning, but now there was no movement there, only the still, pale scatter of chalk that looked almost like a dusting of snow. The outcrop from which the stones had fallen was a low, weathered face of chalk that rose a few feet above the grass, its surface rough and pitted from centuries of rain and wind, and it glowed with a soft, pearly luminescence in the starlight, a pale beacon that marked the upper edge of the pasture. To your right, the hillside curved around into a shallow, sheltered hollow where the grass grew longer and greener, fed by a small spring that seeped out of the ground and made a tiny, marshy patch before sinking back into the chalk. The hollow was a favorite resting place for the sheep in the heat of the afternoon, and its grass was always lush and cool, but now in the darkness it was only a deeper shadow, a bowl of darkness that seemed to hold the night more thickly than the open slope. The sound of the spring was so faint that you could not hear it from where you lay, but you knew it was there, a tiny trickle of water that never stopped, even in the driest summers, and the knowledge of it was a comfort, a reminder that the hillside was alive and giving. The sky above all this, the wide, star-filled dome you had been watching for so long, now seemed less like a separate thing and more like a part of the landscape itself, a continuation of the hills and valleys that extended upward into infinity. The stars were reflected in the pale scree and in the dewy grass, tiny points of light that seemed to be scattered across the ground as well as the sky, and the Milky Way, that great river of light, seemed to flow down from the heavens and pour itself into the dark valley below. The boundary between land and sky had become soft and unclear, the horizon a vague line where the dark hills met the darker heavens, and the whole world felt like a single continuous space, a vast quiet room in which you and the flock and the hills and the stars all existed together. You let your eyes move slowly across this landscape, not searching for anything, not thinking about anything, just receiving the shapes and the shadows and the faint, silvery light. The ridge to the north, the valley below, the scree to your left, the hollow to your right, the distant forest, the stream you could not see but could hear and feel, all these things were part of your world, and you knew them as you knew your own breathing. They had been here long before you and would be here long after, and the thought was not sad or frightening, but simply true, a deep, quiet fact that settled into your bones like the warmth of the cloak. A movement caught your eye, something small and quick near the edge of the scree, and you turned your head slightly to look. It was a fox, a small, lean shape that moved with a fluid, silent grace across the pale stones, its body low and its tail sweeping behind it. The fox paused for a moment, lifting its head to sniff the air, and its eyes caught the starlight in a brief green glint. Then it moved on, disappearing into the darker grass beyond the scree, and the night was still again. The sheep had not stirred, either not noticing the fox or not caring, and you watched the place where it had vanished for a moment longer before turning your gaze back to the valley. The darkness of the valley seemed to deepen as you watched, the shadows pooling in the low places and the starlight growing softer and more diffuse. A thin mist was beginning to form along the course of the stream, a faint white vapor that rose from the water and spread across the valley floor in a low layer, its surface as smooth and still as milk in a bowl. The mist caught the starlight and glowed with a soft, pearly luminescence, making the valley look like a shallow lake of light, and the dark hedgerows and trees rose out of it like islands in a pale sea. The mist moved very slightly, shifting and settling with a slow, almost imperceptible drift, and as you watched it thickened and spread, covering the fields and the pastures and the sleeping cattle, until the whole valley was a soft white blanket that hid the stream and the grass and the dark earth. The ridge to the north was still visible above the mist, its dark outline sharp against the sky, and the hillside where you lay was still clear and dry, the night air too high and too cool for the mist to reach. You felt as if you were floating above a cloud, suspended between the stars and the mist, and the sensation was so calm and so dreamlike that you let yourself sink into it, your eyes half closing and your breathing slowing. The mist in the valley, the dark ridge, the pale scree, the sleeping sheep, all combined into a single quiet image that stayed in your mind even when you closed your eyes fully. You opened your eyes again after a time, how long you could not say, and the mist had not changed, the stars had not moved, the sheep had not stirred. The world was exactly as you had left it, still and silent and perfectly at peace, and you knew with a deep, wordless certainty that it would remain so until the first light touched the eastern sky, and the birds began their slow waking. You let your gaze rest on the misty valley for a while longer, then on the dark ridge, then on the pale scree, and finally your eyes returned to the stars overhead, their light steady and eternal, and you lay there in the hollow of the grass, held between the earth and the sky, a small quiet part of the vast sleeping landscape. A change came to the night while you lay in the hollow of the grass, a change so gradual that you noticed it first, not with your eyes, but as a faint shift in the quality of the darkness itself. The stars overhead, which had shone with such cold, clear brilliance, seemed to dim ever so slightly, their light retreating into a softer, more diffuse glow, and the blackness between them began to lighten by the smallest possible degree. You turned your head on the linen cushion and looked toward the east, where the dark shoulder of the ridge had stood as a solid wall of shadow, and you saw there a pale silvery glow that had not been present before, a light that seemed to seep up from behind the hill like water rising slowly through sand. The moon, which had been hidden somewhere far below the horizon when you first lay down, was now beginning its slow climb into the night sky. The first sign was just a faint brightening along the crest of the eastern ridge, a soft, milky luminescence that outlined the curve of the hill with a delicate silver line. It was not yet light in any true sense. It was more like a promise of light, a gentle suggestion that the darkness would not remain complete. The stars nearest to that part of the sky had faded, their small points of brightness swallowed by the spreading glow, and the Milky Way, which had arced so clearly overhead, now seemed to pale and recede from the east as if making room for something larger. You watched the ridge with the patient, unfocused gaze of someone who has no need to hurry, and as the minutes passed, the glow intensified, spreading upward and outward, its color changing from a faint milky gray to a cooler, more definite silver. Then the first sliver of the moon itself appeared above the ridge, a thin, curved blade of light so sharp and so bright that it seemed to cut through the darkness like a fine silver knife through dark cloth. It was only the upper edge at first, a tiny arc of brilliance that grew slowly as you watched, the curve of it smooth and perfect, its light a pure cold white that made the stars look warm by comparison. The moon was a thin crescent this night, a slender sickle that would travel across the sky for a few hours before setting again in the west, and its light, though not as strong as that of a full moon, was enough to transform the hillside into a place of soft shadows and gentle silver highlights. You lay still and watched the crescent rise, its shape becoming more distinct with each passing moment, the dark portion of the moon's face barely visible as a faint, ghostly circle against the black sky, a shadow within a shadow that gave depth to the bright sliver. As the moon cleared the ridge and began its slow ascent, its light spilled over the landscape like a tide of cool, pale water, and everything it touched was changed. The first thing it found was the grass on the upper slope, the same short, cropped turf that had been a dark grey blanket in the starlight. The moonlight caught the tips of the grass stems and turned them into a fine silver fur, a delicate, shimmering carpet that seemed to ripple even though there was no wind. Each blade stood out with a clarity that had been absent before, its edges sharp and bright, its shadow a tiny dark line on the ground beside it. The effect spread downward as the moon rose, a wave of silver illumination that flowed across the hillside, and you watched it approach with the quiet, passive attention that the night encouraged. The sheep nearest to you were the next to be touched, and the moonlight fell on their sleeping bodies with a gentleness that made them look like stones worn smooth by a river. Their wool took on a cool bluish tint, the natural warmth of the dirty white fleece replaced by something colder and more ethereal, and the curves of their backs and flanks were outlined in a soft silver glow that made each animal look sculpted from some pale, luminous stone. The ewe closest to your head, the one with the dark patch over her eye, lay with her side facing the moon, and you could see the way the light caught the individual locks of her fleece, the tiny shadows between them, creating a fine, intricate texture like the grain of wood or the surface of rippled water. Her breathing was slow and regular, and each time her side rose the pattern of light and shadow shifted slightly, a subtle living movement that was deeply soothing to watch. Beyond the flock, the thorn bushes and the stunted oak that you had seen earlier as dark, shapeless masses now resolved into more detailed forms under the moonlight. The thorn bushes revealed the tangles of their branches, each twig outlined in silver on one side and lost in deep black shadow on the other, creating a complex wiry pattern that stood out sharply against the paler grass. The oak tree showed its crooked trunk and the spread of its low branches, the leaves on the outermost twigs catching the light in small, glittering points, while the inner parts of the canopy remained a dense, dark mystery. The tree cast a shadow that stretched across the grass, a long distorted shape that moved almost imperceptibly as the moon climbed higher, and you found your eyes drawn to this shadow, watching its slow creep with the same idle fascination that you might give to the movement of clouds. Your own body had become part of the moonlit landscape, and you looked down at yourself with a detached, dreamy curiosity. Your hands, still crossed on your chest, were bathed in the cool, silver light, and the skin of your fingers and wrists had taken on a pale, almost marble-like quality. The lines on your palms, the small, fine creases that you had earned from years of work and weather, showed as delicate dark tracings against the pale skin, a tiny map of a life lived out of doors. The rough wool of your tunic, which in the daylight was a warm, earthy brown, now appeared as a deep-shadowed grey, its texture highlighted by the moonlight in a way that made every thread and every weave pattern visible. Even the small frayed edge of the sleeve, where the wool had worn thin from many months of rubbing against your arm, was clearly defined, a tiny detail that you had never noticed before. The shepherd's crook, lying on the grass beside you, had also been transformed. The long ash shaft, which had been a dark, almost invisible line in the starlight, now gleamed with a soft, silver sheen, the polished wood reflecting the moonlight in a narrow, bright stripe that ran its entire length. The curved crook at the top, shaped from a naturally bent branch, cast a small hook-shaped shadow on the grass that moved as slowly as the shadow of the oak. A small knot in the wood, a dark circular blemish that your thumb had worn smooth over the years, stood out clearly in the moonlight, its edges crisp and its center deep. You reached out a hand, moving slowly so as not to disturb the stillness, and touched the wood with your fingertips, feeling its cool, smooth surface and the slight warmth that still lingered from the day. The moonlight continued its slow advance across the hillside, and as it did so it revealed more and more of the landscape that the starlight had only hinted at. The patch of scree to your left, which had been a pale grey smear, now showed its individual stones, each one a small distinct shape, with its own highlight and its own shadow. The chalky stones, which were naturally white, glowed with an almost luminous brightness, their surfaces catching and reflecting the moonlight so strongly that they seemed to emit their own faint radiance. The hollow to your right, with its longer grass and its hidden spring, remained mostly in shadow, but the moonlight touched the upper edge of it and made the grass there shine like a fringe of silver hair, the blades bending under their own weight, and the light pooling in the small cupped spaces between them. The mist that had formed in the valley below now showed itself not as a white blanket, but as a softly glowing sea, its surface smooth and even, its edges lapping against the lower slopes like a tide of pale light. The moonlight seemed to sink into the mist and spread through it, illuminating it from within, so that the entire valley was filled with a diffuse pearly radiance that made the dark hedgerows and trees look like islands floating in a lake of milk. A few of the taller trees poked through the mist, their upper branches catching the direct moonlight and standing out as sharp, dark silhouettes against the glowing background, and the whole scene had a quality of unreality, as if the world below had been replaced by some quiet, enchanted dreamscape. You turned your gaze back to the moon itself, which was now fully clear of the ridge and climbing steadily into the eastern sky. Its crescent shape was delicate and precise, a thin white arc that seemed almost too perfect to be real, and the dark portion of its face, the part that was not illuminated by the sun, was just barely visible as a faint ashy circle within the curve of the crescent. This was the earth shine, the light reflected from the earth itself that lit the moon's dark side, and it gave the crescent a sense of roundness and depth, a reminder that the moon was not a flat, two-dimensional shape, but a solid, spherical body hanging in the void. The earthshine was a soft blue-grey glow, much fainter than the bright crescent, and it seemed to pulse slightly in the still air, a gentle, ghostly light that was both beautiful and strange. As you watched the moon, you noticed that it had begun to draw a faint silver path across the landscape, a reflection of its light that moved as it moved. The distant stream, which you could not see directly, must have caught the moonlight on some of its open stretches, because you could now see a thin, bright thread of silver that wound through the misty valley, appearing and disappearing among the dark shapes of the hedgerows. It was a tiny, intermittent glint, a flash of light that came and went as the angle changed, and it was the only movement in the entire landscape, apart from the slow creep of the shadows. You followed the glint with your eyes, tracing the course of the stream from the north to the south, and then you lost it in the mist and let your gaze return to the moon. The shadows on the hillside had moved noticeably now, creeping westward by a hand's breadth or more, and the moonlight had reached the far edge of the flock, touching the wool of the sheep that lay at the outer boundary. Every surface that faced the moon was bright, every surface that faced away was dark, and the whole world was a study in contrasts, a quiet, monochrome painting that changed moment by moment without ever seeming to move. The air was still cool and dry, the slight breeze of earlier having died away completely, and the silence was as deep as it had ever been, broken only by the small sounds of the sheep and the distant murmur of the stream. The moonlight gave the silence a different quality, making it feel more spacious and more still, as if the light itself was a kind of quietness that filled the air and pressed gently against your ears. You let your eyes close for a moment, and behind your lids you could still see the moon. Its image burned into your vision as a faint pale shape that floated in the darkness. When you opened your eyes again, the crescent had moved a little higher, its light now falling on the folded linen of your headrest and on the dark wool of your cloak, turning both into a patchwork of silver and shadow. The folds of the cloak, where the fabric bunched and creased, caught the light in long, sharp lines, and the hollows between the folds were as dark as caves. You traced these lines with your eyes, following them from your chest down to your knees, and then you looked up again at the moon, which seemed to look back at you with a calm, distant patience, its journey across the sky as slow and as steady as the breathing of the sheep. The moon had by now travelled a long way across the sky, its crescent shape arcing high above the western hills, and its light growing thinner and more slant as the night drew on toward its deepest hour. You lay in the hollow of the grass with your cloak wrapped around you, and your head resting on the folded linen, and you could feel that the world had entered a different phase of the darkness, a time when even the small sounds of the flock had softened, and the stillness had become so complete that it seemed to have a texture of its own. This was the deep night, the long, slow stretch between midnight and the first hint of dawn, and everything in it was quiet and heavy and profoundly calm. The flock around you had sunk into a state of absolute rest, their bodies motionless on the grass, their breathing so slow and so regular that it had become a single unified sound, a soft, continuous whisper of air that rose and fell like the breathing of the hills themselves. You could hear the nearest sheep most clearly, the old ewe with the dark patch over her eye, whose side rose and fell with a deep, steady rhythm that you had been listening to for hours. Each breath she took with a long, slow inhalation that lifted her woolly flank a visible distance, followed by a pause that seemed to last for several heartbeats, and then a gentle sighing exhalation that rustled the grass near her nose and sent a faint, warm puff of air into the cool night. The rhythm was so predictable and so calm that you had matched your own breathing to it without thinking, your chest rising as hers rose and falling as hers fell, until the boundary between your body and her body, between shepherd and sheep, had become blurred and indistinct. The lamb that lay pressed against her side breathed in a different pattern, a quicker, lighter rhythm that was only just audible above the deeper sound of the ewe. Its small rib cage rose and fell with a rapid, fluttering motion, its breaths coming in tiny, soft gasps that seemed to skim the surface of sleep, and every so often it would let out a small, unconscious sound, a faint, high-pitched murmur that was not quite a bleat and not quite a sigh. The sound was so small and so brief that you would have missed it if you had not been lying so close, and it was followed each time by a slight shift of the lamb's body, a tiny, involuntary movement that pressed it closer to its mother's warmth. The ewe, in her deep sleep, seemed to sense this movement, and she would respond with a soft, rumbling sound from deep in her chest, a sound that was less a vocalization and more a vibration, a low, continuous hum that you could feel through the ground as much as hear through the air. Beyond these two, the rest of the flock contributed their own quiet notes to the symphony of breath that filled the hillside. A wether lying a few paces to your right breathed with a slow, heavy rhythm that had a slight wheeze at the end of each exhalation, a soft whistling sound that came from deep in his throat and that you had noticed on many previous nights. It was not a sound of distress, just a small peculiarity of his particular body, and it had become as familiar to you as the shape of his horns or the way he always walked at the rear of the flock. Another ewe, younger and lighter, breathed with a clean, silent rhythm that made no sound at all, her sides moving so gently that you could only see the motion if you looked directly at her, and even then it was as subtle as the movement of a leaf in the faintest breeze. A third sheep, the ram with the curling horns who slept apart from the others, took deep, slow breaths that seemed to come from the very bottom of his lungs, each one a long, deliberate filling and emptying that made his whole body expand and contract in a smooth, powerful wave. You let your attention drift from one animal to the next, following the different rhythms as a person might follow the different instruments in a quiet piece of music. The old ewe with the torn ear, who lay near the edge of the flock, breathed in a pattern that was slightly irregular, her breaths coming in pairs with a short pause between each pair, and you listened to this for a while, noting the way the pause seemed to stretch longer and longer as she sank deeper into sleep. The lamb that had kicked in its dream earlier was now perfectly still, its breathing so light and so fast that it was almost a vibration, a tiny, rapid flutter that you could see in the rise and fall of its small, round belly. The whole flock was alive with breath, a quiet, collective respiration that filled the night air with a gentle, continuous motion, and you lay at the center of it, surrounded and held by the simple fact of their breathing. Your own breathing had become something you were aware of, not as a voluntary action, but as a distant, automatic process, a soft tide of air that moved in and out of your body without any effort on your part. You could feel the cool air entering your nose and traveling down into your lungs, a thin, clean stream that spread through your chest and then returned warmer and slower to leave your body and mingle with the night. The rhythm of it was slow and deep, matching the rhythm of the ewe beside you, and each breath seemed to draw the stillness deeper into your body, filling you with a calm that was almost of physical substance. Your heartbeat, which you could feel as a faint regular pulse in your chest and in your temples and in the tips of your fingers, had slowed to a pace that was barely faster than your breathing, a steady, quiet drum that marked the passing of the deep night without any sense of urgency. The warmth of your body, trapped by the cloak and the wool of your tunic, had created a small, private climate inside your clothing, a pocket of heat that was very different from the cool air on your face. You could feel this warmth spreading through your chest and your stomach and your legs, a gentle, diffuse heat that seemed to radiate from your core outward, and it was especially noticeable where your crossed hands rested on your chest, the palms pressing down with a light, steady pressure that was both grounding and comforting. The cloak itself had absorbed some of your body heat and was now a warm, heavy weight that wrapped around you from shoulders to ankles, its rough wool soft against your skin where your tunic did not cover. Its folds settled into place so perfectly that you felt no need to shift or adjust. The ground beneath you had cooled during the night, the last of the sun's warmth having long since seeped away into the deeper earth, but the cloak and the grass beneath it provided enough insulation that the cold had not reached your body. You could feel the firmness of the earth through the layers, a solid, unyielding presence that supported you without any give, and the slight unevenness of the ground, the small hummocks and hollows that you had smoothed out when you first laid the cloak, had molded themselves to the shape of your body, creating a natural cradle that held you in place. The sensation of being held by the earth was a deep, primal comfort, a reminder that the ground was always there, always solid, always ready to receive the weight of a resting body. Your eyelids had grown heavy some time ago, though you could not have said exactly when, and they now rested closed more often than open, the darkness behind them, a soft, warm red that was very different from the cold, silver darkness of the moonlit hillside. When you opened your eyes, which you did only occasionally and without any real intention, the world seemed to have changed very little. The moon was still a little higher, the shadows still a little longer, the sheep still breathing in their slow, steady rhythms. The crescent moon had now passed the high point of its arc and was beginning its descent toward the western hills, and its light had taken on a slightly warmer tone, the silver cooling into something softer and more muted. The mist in the valley had thickened further, its surface now a smooth white blanket that hid everything below, and the ridge to the north had become a dark, floating island in a sea of pale vapor. You let your eyes close again and turned your attention inward, to the small sensations of your own body at rest. The slight ache in your shoulders from the day's walking had faded to a dull, pleasant warmth, a reminder of effort that had been released into stillness. The muscles of your legs, which had carried you up the long slope from the village, were now completely relaxed, their fibers soft and loose against the bones, and you could feel the weight of them pressing down into the ground, heavy and still. Your feet, which had been dusty and tired when you first lay down, were now warm inside your sandals, the leather straps loose and comfortable, the soles resting flat against the cloak. Even the small of your back, which sometimes troubled you on hard ground, had found a position of ease in the hollow of the grass, the slight arch of your spine supported by the natural curve of the earth. Your mind, which had been active earlier with memories and observations and the quiet cataloguing of the night, had now grown still, its usual chattering reduced to a faint, distant murmur that was barely audible. Thoughts still arose from time to time, small unconnected images and fragments of memory that floated up like bubbles in still water. But you did not chase them or hold on to them. You simply let them rise and pass, each one dissolving back into the quiet from which it had come. A picture of the village in the morning light, the thatched roofs golden and the smoke rising straight from the chimneys, drifted through your mind and then faded. A memory of the taste of the cheese, the cool creaminess on your tongue, came and went. The sound of the stream, the distant continuous murmur that you could still hear at the very edge of your perception, wove itself into your thoughts and then slipped away. None of these things disturbed the deep calm that had settled over you. They were just part of the texture of the night, like the breathing of the sheep or the slow movement of the stars. The deep night had its own sense of time, a time that was not measured in hours or minutes, but in the slow, almost imperceptible changes that came with the turning of the earth. You had no way of knowing how long you had lain there, how many hours had passed since you first spread your cloak on the grass and settled down among the flock, and you had no need to know. The night was not something to be measured or counted, it was something to be experienced, a vast quiet space in which you were a small peaceful presence, and the only clock that mattered was the rhythm of your own breath and the breath of the sheep and the slow steady beat of your heart. You became aware after a long while that the quality of the darkness had begun to shift in a way that was almost too subtle to notice. The sky overhead, which had been a deep velvety black scattered with stars, seemed to have lightened by a fraction, the blackness giving way to a very deep blue that was more felt than seen. The stars were still bright, but the faintest ones had begun to fade, their small points of light retreating into the growing blue, and the Milky Way, which had been so clear and distinct, was now a softer, more diffuse glow. The crescent moon, low in the west now, had taken on a warmer, almost amber tint as its light passed through the thicker air near the horizon, and its reflection in the misty valley had become a broad golden smear that spread across the white vapor like oil on water. The deep night was not yet over, but it had passed its peak, and the long, slow turn toward morning had begun. You did not think about the morning, did not anticipate the dawn or plan for the day ahead. You simply noticed the change and let it pass through you, returning your attention to the warmth of your body and the weight of your limbs and the soft, continuous sound of the flock breathing around you. The ewe beside you had not stirred, her breathing still deep and regular, and the lamb was still pressed against her flank, its small body rising and falling with its own quick rhythm. The whole flock was still asleep, still peaceful, still held in the quiet embrace of the deep night, and you lay among them, your eyes closed and your body heavy, drifting on the slow current of the darkness toward whatever came next. The deep blue of the sky began to pale by the smallest possible degrees, a change so gradual that it registered not as a single moment, but as a slow, cumulative shift that you only fully noticed after it had already happened. The stars that had been so bright and numerous during the deepest hours of the night had dimmed one by one, their light retreating into a soft, grey background that spread from the east like a tide of thinning ink. The crescent moon, which had travelled all the way across the heavens and now hung low above the western hills, had faded to a thin, ghostly sliver, its light no longer silver, but a pale, watery gold that barely touched the grass. The Milky Way had dissolved into the brightening sky, its misty band of stars becoming first a faint suggestion and then nothing at all, absorbed by the slow, steady growth of the dawn. You lay still in the hollow of the grass, your body heavy with the weight of a night spent resting but not yet fully asleep, and you watch the eastern ridge with the quiet, passive attention of someone who has no need to move. The ridge itself, which had been a solid wall of darkness for so many hours, now showed its contours more clearly, its outline sharpening against the lightening sky. The black silhouette of the hill softened into a deep, muted green-gray, and then into a color that was not quite green and not quite gray, but something in between, a neutral, shadowy tone that was the first hint of the returning world. The mist in the valley below, which had been a smooth white sea in the moonlight, now began to show its own internal structure, thin patches and thicker patches, places where the vapor was already lifting, and places where it still clung to the ground in dense, heavy folds. The first sound of the new day came not from the sheep or from the land, but from the air above you, a single high note that seemed to materialize out of the silence without any warning. It was a skylark, the same bird perhaps that you had heard during the afternoon walk, and it had risen from the grass somewhere on the upper slope and climbed into the pale sky on wings that were too small to see. Its song poured down from that high, invisible point, a stream of liquid notes that tumbled over one another in an endless, bubbling cascade, and the sound was so clear and so pure in the still morning air that it seemed to fill the whole world. The lark sang for a long time, its voice never pausing, never faltering, and you lay with your eyes half closed, letting the music wash over you like a gentle rain. Other birds joined the chorus as the light continued to grow, each species adding its own voice to the slow waking of the hillside. A blackbird, somewhere down in the thorn bushes, began a series of rich, fluting phrases that rose and fell with a calm, measured beauty, each note distinct and round, like drops of water falling into a still pool. A pair of sparrows started a busy, chattering conversation in the branches of the stunted oak, their small, quick chirps overlapping in a constant, lively stream. Farther away near the stream, perhaps, a cuckoo called once with its two-note voice, a sound that was both familiar and strange, a voice from the hidden places of the valley that spoke of deep thickets and cool shade. The birdsong filled the air with a soft, complex texture, a woven fabric of sound that had no sharp edges and no sudden changes, and it became the background to everything else that followed. The sheep began to stir in response to the growing light, and the chorus of birds, their deep sleep lifting slowly like the mist in the valley. The first to move was the old ewe with the dark patch over her eye, the same one who had led the flock during the afternoon, gather, and who had lain beside you through the whole night. She lifted her head from the grass with a slow, deliberate motion, her ears swiveling forward to catch the sounds of the morning, and she let out a long, soft breath that clouded in the cool air before dispersing. Her lamb, feeling the movement of its mother, stirred and stretched its small legs, the tiny hooves pushing against the grass, and then it lifted its head too, its ears floppy and its eyes still half closed with sleep. The ewe turned her head to nuzzle the lamb briefly, a gentle automatic gesture of reassurance, and then she looked out across the hillside with the calm, patient gaze of an animal that had seen many mornings, and would see many mornings, and would see many more. The movement spread through the flock in the same unhurried way that all movements did among sheep, a slow, rippling wave of small adjustments and quiet sounds. A wether rose to his feet with a grunt. his heavy body swaying as he found his balance, and then he stood still, chewing on nothing in particular while he waited for the rest of the world to catch up. Another ewe got up more quickly, her joints cracking softly, and she took a few steps toward a patch of grass that looked particularly inviting, her head lowering to graze even before she had fully stopped walking. The lambs were the slowest to rise, their small bodies still heavy with sleep, but one by one they pushed themselves up on unsteady legs and pressed close to their mothers, seeking the first warm milk of the day. You remained lying on your cloak, your hands still crossed on your chest, and you watched the flock begin its slow morning routine without any sense that you needed to join them. The grass around you was wet with dew, a fine silvery coating of moisture that had settled during the deep night, and that now sparkled in the growing light, each blade tipped with a tiny, glistening drop. The dew had beaded on the wool of your cloak too, small round droplets that caught the pale light and held it, and when you shifted your arm a few of them rolled together and fell onto the ground with a soft, silent touch. The air was cool and damp, carrying the clean, fresh scent of wet grass and damp earth, and something else, a faint green smell that was the scent of the hillside itself, waking and breathing. The light in the east continued to change, the pale grey of the pre-dawn sky giving way to a soft, warm glow that spread upward from behind the ridge. The glow was first a faint lemon yellow that touched the undersides of the few thin clouds that had appeared during the night, painting them with delicate, golden edges. Then the yellow deepened into a soft, rosy pink that spread across the whole eastern horizon, its color so subtle and so beautiful that you let your gaze rest on it for a long time, simply watching the slow, silent spectacle of the sunrise. The pink intensified for a few moments, becoming almost coral, and then it began to fade as the first direct rays of the sun climbed over the ridge and struck the hillside. The sunlight arrived not as a sudden flash, but as a gradual spreading warmth that crept across the grass toward you, with the slow pace of a shadow moving in reverse. First the thorn bushes on the upper slope were touched, their dark branches suddenly outlined in gold, and then the patch of scree, which blazed into brilliant white as the light hit the chalky stones. The wave of light advanced down the slope, illuminating the cropped turf and the scattered clover and the dark recumbent shapes of the sheep, and, as it reached each one, the wool seemed to warm and glow, the dirty white fleece transformed into soft, creamy gold. When the sunlight finally reached your own face, you felt it as a gentle, pleasant heat on your closed eyelids, a warmth that was entirely different from the cool air of the night, and you let it rest there for a moment before opening your eyes to the full brightness of the day. The world that the sunlight revealed was the same world that the starlight and the moonlight had shown, but it was also entirely different. Its colors returned, and its details sharp and clear. The grass was no longer gray or silver, but a rich, vibrant green, each blade distinct and individual, and the clover leaves showed their pale three-lobed shapes and their tiny white flowers that had closed during the night and were now beginning to open again. The thorn bushes were a dark, glossy green, their small leaves shiny with dew, and the stunted oak showed the rough furrowed texture of its bark and the lighter, silvery undersides of its leaves. The chalky stones of the scree were a clean, bright white, their surfaces glinting in the sunlight, and the distant stream, now visible as a thin, shining ribbon, wound its way through the valley floor with a clarity that had been entirely absent in the dark. The mist in the valley was lifting quickly, rising from the fields and the pastures in thin, white tendrils that curled and twisted in the warming air. The dark shapes of the hedgerows and the trees emerged from the vapour as the mist thinned, their colours returning as they dried, and the sleeping cattle in the pastures became visible as small dark dots that slowly began to move. The ridge to the north, which had been a dark, silent presence all night, now showed its full green-grey slopes, and the pale grassy plateau at its summit, and the clump of beech trees on the top was clearly visible, their leaves a dark, rich green against the pale sky. The distant forest to the south was no longer a black line on the horizon, but a broad, textured expanse of deep green that stretched away into the blue-grey haze of the far hills. You sat up slowly, pushing yourself up with your hands, and the cloak fell away from your shoulders and pulled around your waist. The movement was the first significant one you had made in many hours, and your body responded with a pleasant, drowsy stiffness that was the sign of a long, deep rest. You stretched your arms above your head, feeling the pull of the muscles in your shoulders and back, and then you rubbed your face with your palms, the rough skin of your hands against the sleep-warm skin of your cheeks. The morning air was cool on your face and neck, but the sunlight was already beginning to take the edge off the chill, and you knew that the day would be warm and fair. The flock was fully awake now, spread out across the hillside in their usual scattered pattern, grazing on the wet grass with the steady, mechanical patience of sheep everywhere. The lambs had finished their morning feed and were beginning to explore the world with small, wobbly steps, sniffing at unfamiliar tufts of grass and butting playfully at one another in a slow, gentle imitation of the adult rams. The ewes kept a watchful eye on them, lifting their heads from time to time to check that everything was as it should be. But there was no anxiety in their watching, only the calm, attentive awareness that was their natural state. The young ram with the curling horns had walked a little way apart from the others and was standing on a small rise, his head lifted and his nostrils flaring as he sampled the morning air, looking for all the world like a sentinel on duty. You folded the linen headrest and tucked it back into the leather pouch, then shook out your cloak to remove the worst of the dew and the grass stems that had clung to it during the night. The wool was damp on the outside, but still warm on the inside, and you wrapped it around your shoulders again, settling it into place with a practised shrug. The shepherd's crook, which had lain beside you through the whole night, you picked up and ran your hand along its smooth, familiar length, your thumb finding the worn knot in the wood and resting there for a moment. Then you pushed yourself to your feet, standing upright on the grass, with the crook in one hand and the pouch in the other, and you looked out across the waking hillside with a quiet, wordless contentment. You took the water bottle from the pouch and pulled the wooden stopper free, then lifted the bottle to your lips and drank a slow, deep swallow. The water was no longer as cold as it had been during the evening, but it was still cool and clean, and it washed the dryness from your mouth and throat and left you feeling refreshed and alert. You replaced the stopper and put the bottle away, then simply stood for a while, your weight resting on the crook, your eyes moving across the flock and the hills and the sky with the calm, unhurried attention of a shepherd who has nowhere else to be. The sun was fully above the ridge now, a bright, warm disk that was already too bright to look at directly, and its light flooded the hillside with a generous, golden radiance. The shadows had shortened and sharpened, each sheep and each thorn bush casting a dark, crisp shape on the grass, and the dew was beginning to evaporate, rising from the ground in a faint, invisible mist that carried the scent of wet earth and green things into the air. The bird song, which had been so loud and so constant during the first light, was beginning to quieten as the birds settled into their daytime routines, and the world was returning to its normal daytime sounds. The soft cropping of the sheep, the rustle of the breeze in the grass, the distant murmur of the stream, the occasional call of a crow from the valley below. You did not hurry to move the flock or to begin the day's work. There was time, as there was always time, and the sheep were content to graze and rest and graze again without any direction from you. You walked slowly to the edge of the flock, your sandals pressing into the damp grass and leaving dark, temporary footprints that would fade as the sun dried the turf. And you stood looking down at the valley and the stream and the fields that you knew so well. The world was the same as it had always been, and you were the same. And the night had passed as nights always passed, in quiet and stillness and the slow, steady breathing of the flock. The morning had arrived without any announcement, and the day would unfold as days always did, and you were simply there, a shepherd on a hillside, with nothing more to do than to be present and to wait and to let the world turn around you.